Beatrice Hollis had the panicked mare halfway calmed when the second crate slid loose from the wagon bed and cracked open against the boardwalk, spilling tinned goods across Juniper Flat's main street for the whole town to watch. The mare had spooked at nothing more than a dropped hammer 2 shops down, but 6 months of exhaustion had left Beatrice's own reflexes slower than they should have been, and by the time she'd caught the bridle, the wagon had already lurched hard enough to send the first crate sliding. She braced her boots against the boardwalk and held firm, feeling the animal's fear travel up through her own tired arms, and thought, not for the first time that autumn, that her husband had made this particular labor look considerably easier than it actually was. She heard the murmurs before she saw the faces, the particular low buzz of a crowd that had gathered to observe rather than assist, and she kept both hands firm on the mare's bridle, refusing to let her own hands shake the way her chest wanted them to. 6 months a widow, and she had learned already that Juniper Flat's sympathy came with strings attached, and today those strings had apparently run out entirely. "Somebody going to help her," a woman's voice said from the crowd. Not quite a question, not quite an offer either. Nobody moved. Beatrice recognized most of the faces watching, men who had bought flour and nails from her husband's depot for a decade, women who had once brought her soup when Thomas first fell ill, all of them now standing with the particular careful stillness of people who had heard enough whispered warnings about the Hollis accounts to decide caution outweighed kindness. She recognized, too, the particular way several of them avoided her eyes directly, the small, guilty stillness of neighbors who understood, somewhere beneath their careful hesitation, that what they were doing was not quite decent, and chose to do it anyway, rather than risk their own reputations by association. It was a particular kind of loneliness, she thought, standing there with her arms shaking from the mare's weight, to be surrounded by people who had once called themselves friends and now found it easier to simply watch. It was Garrett Holloway who finally moved, stepping out from the edge of the crowd without a word, crossing the street with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed an audience's permission to do a plain, necessary thing. He took the mare's bridle from Beatrice's hands gently, murmuring something low the horse alone was meant to hear, and the animal settled almost immediately under his steady grip. Beatrice stood back, breathing hard, watching a rancher she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 6 months quiet an animal the whole town had just watched her fight alone. "Crates split," Garrett said, nodding toward the spilled tins. "I'll get the rest unloaded properly, if you'll hold the horse a moment." She held the horse. He unloaded the wagon. Juniper Flat, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1885, was a modest supply town serving the ranches and mining claims scattered through the surrounding foothills, its whole practical existence organized around 2 competing freight operations that kept goods moving in and out along the valley road. Thomas Hollis had built the smaller of the 2 depots from nothing over 12 years, earning a reputation for fair prices and honest weights that had, until recently, kept his loyal customers coming even when Elijah Crane's larger operation across town offered faster delivery. Thomas had been, by every account Beatrice had ever heard from customers and neighbors alike, a careful and generous man, the sort who extended credit to struggling homesteaders through hard winters and never once mentioned it afterward, the sort who weighed a sack of flour twice if a customer so much as raised an eyebrow at the scale. He had built that reputation slowly, the same patient way he'd built everything else in his life, and Beatrice had watched him do it for the 7 years of their marriage with the particular pride of a woman who understood exactly how much quiet effort such a reputation actually required to maintain. She still kept his ledger pen in the desk drawer where he'd always left it, and found herself, some evenings, simply holding it a moment before beginning her own work, a small private ritual that helped steady her for the hours of careful arithmetic ahead. She had loved him plainly and completely, and the particular grief of watching his good name come under quiet attack, when he himself was no longer present to defend it, had settled into her chest as something considerably heavier than ordinary widowhood alone. Thomas had died in the spring, a wasting illness that took him slow and left Beatrice, 29 years old, holding the depot's accounts, its remaining inventory, and a business reputation that had begun, in the months since, eroding in ways she could not immediately trace to any single cause. It started small, a driver who'd worked for Thomas 8 years, suddenly finding other employment, a longtime customer quietly switching his account to Crane's larger operation, a supplier in Denver growing strangely slow to answer her letters. Beatrice had assumed, at first, simple ordinary difficulty, the natural uncertainty of customers wondering whether a widow could properly run what her husband had built. It took her considerably longer to understand that someone was actively encouraging that uncertainty. Garrett Holloway ran a modest cattle operation on the valley's eastern edge, a quiet man of 40, who had, by Juniper Flat's collective memory, kept largely to himself since a courtship gone wrong some 15 years back had taught him more than he'd ever wanted to know about how quickly a town's opinion could turn on rumor alone. He bought his supplies from the Hollis depot out of simple long habit, and had continued doing so through the autumn without much comment, unbothered by whispers he considered beneath his attention. His ranch was solid but unremarkable, 400 head of cattle and a modest herd of breeding horses that he tended largely alone, hiring extra hands only during branding season and roundup. He had never married, had built no family beyond the occasional letter from a sister settled in Denver, and had grown, over 15 years of careful solitude, into the particular kind of steady, self-sufficient man that Juniper Flat had long since stopped expecting to change. "You didn't have to step in today," Beatrice told him, once the wagon was properly unloaded and the crowd had drifted back to their own business. "I'd have managed eventually." "Didn't say you wouldn't," Garrett said. Seemed faster with 2 sets of hands is all. She studied him a moment, this quiet rancher who had crossed a whole street of watching neighbors without apparently considering it remarkable. "Most folks in this town have found reasons to keep their distance from my accounts lately," she said. "You don't seem troubled by whatever they're worried about." "Don't put much stock in what I haven't seen with my own eyes," Garrett said. "Your father-in-law's depot always weighed my grain fare. Nothing's changed that I've witnessed personally." It was, Beatrice thought, watching him lead his own horse back toward the hitching post, the first genuinely reassuring sentence anyone in Juniper Flat had offered her in weeks. The whispers, she learned over the following days, through careful, patient inquiry, traced back consistently to the same source, casual remarks dropped at the saloon and the barber shop by men who worked, directly or loosely, for Elijah Crane's freight operation. The remarks were vague enough to avoid outright accusation. A widow struggling with accounts she barely understood, a depot's finances left in uncertain order by a dying man too proud to properly settle his affairs. Nothing so direct as a lie, simply doubt, planted carefully, and left to grow on its own. Beatrice pieced the pattern together the way she imagined Thomas himself might have, patiently and without letting frustration cloud her observations, asking careful questions of the few customers who still trusted her enough to answer honestly. The barber, Mr. Aldous, admitted reluctantly that he'd heard the remarks repeated often enough by Crane's regular drivers that he'd assumed, without much thought, that there must be some truth behind them. It was the particular insidious quality of the whole scheme, she realized, that required no one person to lie outright, only enough scattered doubt for the town's own caution to do the rest of the work unassisted. Beatrice confronted Crane directly at his own office, laying her concerns plainly on his desk. Elijah Crane was a smooth, prosperous man in his 50s, his freight operation having grown considerably since Thomas's illness began, and he received her complaint with an expression of wounded innocence that convinced her, more than any direct evidence could have, exactly where the whispers originated. His office was considerably grander than Thomas's ever-modest desk had been, mahogany and brass fittings that spoke plainly of a business flourishing beyond what honest competition alone could easily explain. Beatrice noted the details with the particular careful attention she had learned, in 6 months of widowhood, to bring to every room she entered, understanding that a man's surroundings often told a truer story than his words did. "I've said nothing about your accounts that wasn't simple concern for a widow's welfare," Crane said, spreading his hands in practiced reasonableness. "If customers have chosen to bring their business here instead, Mrs. Hollis, that's simply the market finding its natural level." "Convenient," Beatrice said, "that the market found its natural level so precisely in the months since my husband could no longer defend his own good name." Crane's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though his voice remained perfectly smooth. I'll not be accused of unfair practice in my own office, Mrs. Hollis, however grieved you may still be." She left his office with nothing resembling proof, only a settled certainty that would take considerably more than her own conviction to convince the rest of Juniper Flat. Garrett began appearing at the depot more regularly than his own supply needs strictly required, splitting kindling for her stove, checking her wagon wheels before long deliveries, once driving a shipment to a distant ranch himself when the driver she'd hired failed to appear at the appointed hour. He never made a show of the help, offering it plainly and accepting her thanks with the same brief nod each time, and Beatrice found herself, more evenings than she examined too closely, glad of the particular steady quiet he brought to a business that had grown considerably lonelier since Thomas's death. He noticed things, too, small practical needs she had not thought to mention aloud, a loose hinge on the storeroom door, a leak in the roof above the grain stores that would have ruined half a season's inventory come the first hard rain. He fixed each one without comment, the way a man fixes things that simply need fixing, and Beatrice began to understand that his particular kind of care spoke considerably more clearly than words might have managed for a man so evidently unpracticed at saying things directly. She thought, watching him patch the roof one gray afternoon, of how differently Thomas had shown his own care, always with a gentle word to accompany any small kindness, and understood that Garrett's silence was not coldness but simply a different language entirely, one she was slowly, patiently, learning to read. She caught herself, more than once, listening for the particular sound of his wagon on the road before she'd fully admitted to herself why the sound mattered. It unsettled her slightly, this quiet attentiveness she had not asked for and had not expected, though she found she did not want it to stop. "You keep showing up exactly when I need an extra pair of hands," she said one evening, watching him check the depot's loading dock for loose boards. "I'm beginning to suspect you're keeping closer watch on my troubles than you let on." "Small town," Garrett said. "Not hard to notice when a good business is being quietly starved out from under a decent woman." "Is that what you think is happening?" He straightened from his work, meeting her eyes directly. "I think Crane's wanted your father-in-law's depot for years, and a dead man's widow struggling alone looked like considerably less trouble than buying it fair at a price Thomas would have actually asked." Beatrice considered that a long moment, turning the observation over the same careful way she turned over most things worth taking seriously. "You've thought about this a good deal more than a casual customer usually would," she said. "Told you," Garrett said. "Small town. And I've got my own reasons for taking a dim view of a man who profits off other people's convenient doubt." It was the most Beatrice had heard him say about the matter directly, and something in his plain certainty steadied her more than weeks of her own private suspicion had managed. She asked him one evening, carefully, why a man so evidently capable of plain speaking had earned Juniper Flat's reputation as its quietest resident. Garrett was silent long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Courted a woman here. 15 years back," he said finally. "Good woman, or I thought so. Her family started hearing rumors about my prospects, my father's debts, things that weren't entirely true but weren't entirely false either. Enough truth mixed in to make the lies stick." He set down his tools. "She believed the rumors over what she knew of me firsthand, married someone else within the year." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said quietly. "Taught me something useful, at least," Garrett said. "Taught me not to trust what a town whispers over what I've actually witnessed with my own eyes. Seems only fair to extend you the same consideration Crane's rumors haven't managed to earn from most everyone else." He told her more of it over the following weeks, in the particular unhurried way he told most things, small pieces offered without her needing to press for them. The woman's name had been Ellen Marsh, and she had married a merchant from Pueblo within a year of breaking off their courtship. And Garrett had heard, second-hand and years later, that the marriage had proven considerably less happy than Ellen's family had once predicted his own prospects would remain. He did not say this with any satisfaction, only the plain, weary honesty of a man recounting something long since settled into simple fact. "Took me the better part of 5 years to trust my own judgment about people again," he admitted one evening. "Longer still to trust anyone else's judgment about me. Easier, most days, to keep to my own fences and my own cattle and let the town think whatever it wanted. Beatrice found, in the weeks that followed, that the fair consideration Garrett extended so plainly began mattering to her considerably more than simple gratitude accounted for. The depot's fortunes did not improve easily. Crane's whispered doubts had done their patient work thoroughly enough that even customers who half suspected the rumor's source found it simpler to take their business elsewhere than to swim against Juniper Flat's cautious current. Beatrice worked longer hours than her own health properly allowed, reviewing Thomas's careful account books late into most evenings, determined to prove through honest arithmetic what gossip alone could not disprove. She had never been trained for bookkeeping the way Thomas had, having married him young and left the depot's finances largely to his careful hands through their whole marriage, and the work of teaching herself his methods from cold ledger pages alone proved considerably harder than she had let herself anticipate. She made mistakes those first weeks, small arithmetic errors that cost her hours to trace and correct, and more than one evening ended with her head in her hands at the depot's back desk, exhausted past the point of clear thinking. It was in those careful late evenings, cross-referencing years of Thomas's meticulous entries, that she found the discrepancy that finally gave her something more solid than suspicion to work with. A supplier's invoice from Denver, dated 2 months before Thomas's death, showed a debt considerably larger than any figure recorded in Thomas's own careful ledger, a debt that matched, suspiciously precisely, a number she had heard whispered around town as evidence of the depot's supposed insolvency. She sat with that discovery a long while before acting on it, checking and rechecking the figures against every other entry she could find, unwilling to raise an accusation she could not fully support. The work took her 3 full evenings, cross-referencing dates and amounts with the same meticulous care Thomas himself had always brought to his own ledgers, understanding that any error on her part would only hand Crane fresh ammunition against her. She wrote to the Denver supplier directly, and the reply that came back 3 weeks later confirmed what she had begun to suspect, arriving on a gray Tuesday morning that she would remember afterward with unusual clarity. No such debt existed on the supplier's own books. Someone had fabricated the invoice entirely, and the supplier's clerk, once pressed for details, recalled the request for a false document coming through a man matching Elijah Crane's description precisely. He built the rumor on paper that never existed, Beatrice told Garrett, laying the supplier's letter on the depot counter between them. Manufactured a debt out of nothing and let it circulate as truth until half the town believed my husband died owing money he never actually owed. Garrett read the letter twice, his jaw working the particular tight way she'd come to recognize as controlled anger. "This is enough to bring before the whole town plainly," he said. "Won't need to argue reputation against rumor anymore. You've got proof the rumor was manufactured deliberately." "I keep turning over how deliberate it actually was," Beatrice said. "The specific figure, the timing so close to Thomas's death, when he'd have been least able to defend himself. It wasn't opportunism, Garrett. It was planned. Man like Crane doesn't build an operation the size of his without a certain amount of planning," Garrett said grimly. "Doesn't make it any less low, going after a grieving widow's good name to do it." He set the letter down carefully on the counter, as though handling something that deserved considerably more respect than the fraud it exposed. "You'll want witnesses at the town meeting. People who can speak plainly to the depot's honest dealing over the years. I'll be one of them, if you'll have me." They brought it before Juniper Flat the following Saturday, at the town meeting held monthly in the church hall for matters of shared community business. The hall was fuller than usual that evening, word having spread that Mrs. Hollis intended to address the depot's troubled fortunes directly, and Beatrice felt the weight of every watching face as she rose from her seat near the front. Beatrice stood before the gathered town with the supplier's letter in hand and read it plainly aloud, watching faces shift from polite attention to genuine shock as the fabrication's full shape became clear. She kept her voice level throughout, resisting the particular urge to let 6 months of accumulated frustration color her delivery, understanding that plain facts, calmly presented, would carry considerably more weight than righteous anger might have managed. Elijah Crane, present as he always was for town business, attempted first to dismiss the letter as some clerk's error. then to suggest Beatrice herself might have misunderstood the correspondence entirely. His protests grew thinner with each attempt, his usual smooth confidence visibly fraying under the weight of a room's collective, sharpening attention, and it was Garrett, standing quietly near the back of the hall, who finally spoke. "I've bought supplies from the Hollis depot my whole time in this valley," he said, his voice carrying plainly through the hushed room. "Fair weights, honest prices, never once a discrepancy I could point to. Whatever debt Mr. Crane's clerk manufactured in Denver, it wasn't built on anything I've witnessed in 6 years of honest dealing with that depot." He did not raise his voice beyond what the room required, understanding, plainly, that certainty spoken calmly carried considerably more weight in a room already primed for doubt than any louder declaration might have managed. Beatrice watched him speak with a gratitude that went considerably beyond the words themselves, understanding that he had chosen, deliberately, to make his support a matter of plain testimony rather than personal favor, the kind of witness that could not easily be dismissed as mere sentiment. 2 other longtime customers rose in turn after Garrett spoke, each offering their own testimony of years of fair dealing with the Hollis depot, and the room's collective doubt, cultivated so patiently over months, collapsed considerably faster than it had been built. Crane left the meeting before its formal conclusion, and within the month, faced with the town's united cooling toward his own operation, quietly sold his freight business and left Juniper Flat entirely, understanding plainly that whatever advantage rumor had once bought him, honest proof had thoroughly undone. The depot's fortunes recovered steadily through the following weeks, old customers returning with the particular sheepish apology of people who understood they had let convenient doubt outweigh years of fair dealing. Beatrice rehired a driver, restocked her shelves properly, and found herself, for the first time since Thomas's death, running a business that felt genuinely her own, rather than simply a burden she was determined not to drop. Mrs. Ferris, who had first raised the tentative voice in the crowd that opening afternoon, came by the depot specifically to apologize for the town's collective silence, admitting plainly that she had felt the wrongness of the moment even then, and had lacked the courage to act on it alone. Beatrice accepted the apology graciously, understanding that Juniper Flat's slow, cautious warming was itself a kind of honest amends, considerably more meaningful than any single grand gesture might have been. Mr. Aldous, too, stopped by within the month, sheepish and apologetic, admitting that he'd repeated Crane's careless remarks to more customers than he cared to count, and offering, by way of amends, to spread word of the depot's cleared name with the same diligence he'd once given the rumors themselves. Beatrice thanked him plainly and put him straight to the task, understanding that a barbershop's gossip, once turned toward honest correction, could undo considerable damage in short order. It was evening, some weeks after the town meeting, when Garrett found her closing the depot for the night, the brass delivery bell above the door ringing softly as he stepped inside. "Bell's been quiet a long while," he observed, glancing up at it. "Good to hear it working again. Been a hard 6 months getting it ringing steady," Beatrice said. "Wouldn't have managed it without a rancher who decided a widow's honest business was worth stepping out of a watching crowd for." Garrett considered that a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands the way she'd noticed he did when choosing words with unusual care. "Wasn't only the business that mattered to me," he said finally. "Started out that way, maybe. Didn't stay that way long." Beatrice set down the ledger she'd been holding. "I'd wondered," she said, "whether you'd ever say so plainly, or simply keep showing up quietly forever and let me guess at the reason." "Never been much good at saying things plainly," Garrett admitted. 15 years of keeping mostly to myself doesn't build much practice at it." "You managed plainly enough in that church hall," she said. "That was easy," Garrett said. "Simple matter of true facts against false ones. This is harder." "Why harder?" He met her eyes steadily. "Because this isn't about proving a rumor false. This is about telling you plainly that I'd like to keep showing up at this depot for reasons that have very little to do with grain and kindling anymore. If you'll have the showing up." Beatrice felt something in her chest loosen that had been carefully bound since the spring, the particular relief of finally hearing plainly what she had suspected gently building for weeks. She thought of every quiet visit, every fixed hinge and split log of kindling, all of it small evidence she had noticed and set carefully aside without letting herself name what it added up to. "I'd have you," she said, "though I'll warn you, I've grown considerably less patient with careful silences since burying a husband who kept his own worries too close for either of our good." "Noted," Garrett said, and something in his expression eased into the particular warmth she had come to watch for, without quite admitting she was watching for it. "I'll work on the plain speaking." "See that you do," Beatrice said, and something in her own voice had gone soft in a way it had not managed in the 6 long months since Thomas's death, softer than she had let herself sound with anyone since the funeral. They did not rush toward anything larger than the quiet understanding already settling between them that evening, both of them having learned, in their separate hard ways, the cost of moving faster than trust properly allowed. Garrett continued appearing at the depot through the following months, though the excuses grew steadily thinner, and neither of them bothered maintaining them much longer. And Juniper Flat, having watched the whole slow courtship unfold with the particular patient interest small towns reserve for stories they've decided they want to see through properly, took the eventual spring wedding with considerably more warmth than the town's earlier cautious distance had ever suggested it capable of. The wedding itself was modest, held in the same church hall where Beatrice had once stood alone reading a supplier's letter to a doubting crowd, and Mrs. Ferris herself organized the small reception afterward, bringing pies and insisting on it with the particular determined generosity of a woman working out old guilt through present kindness. Garrett's sister came down from Denver for the occasion and told Beatrice privately that she had never once, in 15 years, seen her brother look quite so thoroughly, quietly settled. The whole valley seemed to turn out for the small ceremony, ranchers and townsfolk alike filling the modest hall well beyond its usual Sunday crowd. And Beatrice thought, standing at the front of that gathered room with Garrett's steady hand in hers, of how differently this same building had felt the last time she'd stood before it, reading proof of a stranger's cruelty to a room full of uncertain faces. The transformation felt, in its own quiet way, as significant as the marriage itself. Beatrice kept the depot running under her own name, the brass bell above the door ringing steady through every business day that followed, and Garrett split his time between his own ranch and a business he had, in every way that mattered, helped save simply by refusing to let a town's convenient silence outweigh what he had witnessed plainly with his own eyes. The depot prospered steadily in the years that followed, its reputation for fair weights and honest prices restored fully, and then some, tended now by 2 people who understood, each in their own hard-earned way, exactly what that kind of trust actually cost to build and keep. Beatrice hung a small framed copy of the Denver supplier's letter near the depot's front counter in time, not out of lingering bitterness toward Crane, who had long since left the territory entirely, but as a quiet reminder to herself and to every customer who noticed it that honest proof, patiently gathered, could outlast even the most carefully cultivated doubt. Garrett teased her once, gently, that she'd turned her own vindication into a permanent fixture of the depot's decor, and Beatrice had only smiled and said that some lessons deserved a place where a person could see them daily. Some kindnesses, it turned out, needed nothing grander than a quiet man crossing a street the rest of the town had decided to simply watch, and a woman brave enough to keep fighting for what was rightfully hers until someone finally, plainly, stepped up to help her carry it.